Sarah Thompson stared out the rain-streaked window of her childhood home, watching as unfamiliar cars lined the driveway. She hadn't been back to Oak Ridge in nearly 5 years, not since that Christmas when everything fell apart. Now her father was dead, and she was forced to face both the house and the family she'd left behind. "They're all here," her brother Michael said, appearing beside her. At 38, he looked more like their father than ever, the same stern jawline, the same way of standing with hands clasped behind his back. Unlike Sarah, Michael had never left, staying to help run the family business while she escaped to Boston to build her own life. "I still don't understand why Dad wanted everyone here for this," Sarah murmured. "The lawyer could have just sent letters." Michael's expression hardened. Dad did things his way, right until the end. The living room filled with relatives Sarah barely recognized anymore. Cousin Peter, now balding, with a wife she'd never met. Aunt Maggie, somehow smaller than Sarah remembered. Uncle Jim, who refused to meet her eyes. And then there was Rebecca, their younger sister, who slipped in last with her teenage son Ethan in tow. Rebecca nodded curtly at Sarah, but gravitated immediately to Michael, embracing him. The gesture stung, but Sarah swallowed the feeling. What had she expected after disappearing from their lives? "If everyone's present, we can begin," announced Walter Grayson, their father's lawyer for over 40 years. Gray-haired and bespectacled, he sat at Richard Thompson's desk as if the old man might return at any moment to reclaim it. Sarah took a seat on the window bench, away from the others. She wasn't here for money. Her career as an architect had made her financially independent. She was here because, despite everything, Richard Thompson had been her father, and something inside her needed closure. "Before I read Richard's will," Walter began, "he asked me to play this for you." He placed a digital recorder on the desk and pressed play. The room fell silent as Richard Thompson's voice, still commanding even from beyond the grave, filled the space Sarah had spent her adult life trying to escape. "If you're hearing this, I've finally done what everyone's been waiting for. I've died." A bitter chuckle followed. "I've never been one to mince words, so I'll be direct. I've made choices in my life, some good, many bad. I wasn't the father or the man I should have been." Sarah felt a lump forming in her throat. These weren't the words she'd expected from her unyielding father. "What I'm about to do will upset some of you. Others might feel vindicated. But I've decided that before I leave this world, I'm going to tell the truth and try to make amends in the only way I can now." Walter stopped the recording and looked up. Richard amended his will 3 months ago, after his diagnosis. What I'm about to read reflects his final wishes. The air in the room grew heavy. Sarah watched Michael straighten his shoulders, Rebecca clutch her son's hand. "To my son Michael, who stayed when others left," Walter read, "I leave control of Thompson Construction, with the condition that you immediately promote Jake Wilson to partner." Michael's face flushed. "Jake? My foreman? Dad can't be serious." Walter continued without acknowledging the outburst. "Jake has been more loyal than you know. In fact, he's been protecting this family from my mistakes for years." "What mistakes?" Rebecca interrupted, but Walter raised a hand to silence her. "To my daughter Rebecca, I leave the family home and half of my personal savings." Rebecca's eyes widened. The house was worth millions, situated on the best lot in Oak Ridge. "To my grandson Ethan, I establish a trust for education and future endeavors, to be administered by Walter until he turns 25. Walter paused, adjusting his glasses before delivering the bombshell. "And to my daughter Sarah, who had the courage to leave when this family became toxic, I leave the remaining half of my savings and my shares in Riverfront Development." The room erupted. Michael stood abruptly. "Riverfront? That's the biggest project we've ever undertaken. Those shares are worth more than the company itself." Sarah felt the room spinning. Riverfront was a massive mixed-use development that would transform downtown Oak Ridge. Her father had been buying land for it secretly for years. "There's more," Walter said firmly. "Richard left letters for each of you, private correspondence to be read alone." He handed out sealed envelopes. Sarah took hers with trembling fingers. "This is ridiculous," Michael growled. "Sarah abandoned this family. She hasn't even spoken to Dad in 3 years, and now she gets Riverfront?" "Michael," Rebecca cautioned, glancing at her son who was watching the adults with wide eyes. "No, I want to hear her explain why she deserves any of this," Michael insisted, turning to Sarah. "You left us to clean up every mess. You weren't here when Dad started drinking again after Mom died. You weren't here when the business almost went under. You just ran away to your perfect new life. The old anger and guilt washed over Sarah. You don't know anything about my life, Michael. I know you turned your back on your family. Sarah stood, surprising herself with her steadiness. I left because Dad made it impossible to stay. You know what he was like. He changed, Rebecca said quietly. After his heart attack 2 years ago. You wouldn't know because you never called, never visited. I tried, Sarah whispered. He always hung up. Walter cleared his throat. Richard anticipated this reaction. There's more on the recording. He pressed play again, and their father's voice silenced the brewing argument. I know this will cause conflict. That's on me, not on any of you. But before you tear each other apart, read the letters. Understand why I've done this. There are things you don't know, things I should have told you years ago. The recording ended. Sarah looked down at the envelope in her hands, her name written in her father's bold handwriting. Whatever was inside would change everything. She could feel it. This meeting is adjourned, Walter announced. I suggest you all take time to process before discussing further. As the family dispersed in tense silence, Sarah caught Michael's eye. The hurt and betrayal she saw there mirrored what she'd felt years ago. History was repeating itself. Only this time, their father had cast her in his role, the one with all the power. Outside, the rain had stopped, but dark clouds still hung over Oak Ridge. Sarah clutched her father's letter, knowing that whatever truths it contained would either heal her family's wounds or deepen them beyond repair. Sarah sat in her rental car outside her father's house, Rebecca's house now, staring at the unopened letter on the passenger seat. The family had scattered after the reading of the will, each retreating to process what had happened. She'd almost torn the envelope open right there in the living room, but something told her she needed privacy for whatever her father had to say. She finally drove to Oak Ridge Park, a small green space where she'd spent countless hours as a teenager, sketching buildings and dreaming of a life beyond this town. The old wooden bench beneath the maple tree was still there, weathered but standing. Sarah sat down and, with a deep breath, opened her father's letter. Sarah, it began, the handwriting more unsteady than the signature on the envelope. By now you know about Riverfront. You're probably wondering why I would leave my most valuable asset to the daughter who ran away. The truth is, Riverfront was always meant to be yours. Sarah's hands began to tremble. What no one else knows is that the initial concept for Riverfront was based on designs I found in your old sketchbooks after you left. The mixed-use approach, the green spaces, the community center, these were all your ideas. I took them without asking and claimed them as my own. She pressed a hand to her mouth, memories flooding back. Those sketches had been her senior project in high school, her vision for what downtown Oak Ridge could become. Her father had dismissed them at the time, calling them impractical daydreams. I tell myself I did it to stay connected to you somehow. But the truth is, I stole from you because your ideas were brilliant. Thompson Construction has built its future on your vision, and you deserve to own that. Tears blurred Sarah's vision now, making it difficult to read the increasingly unsteady handwriting. There's more you need to know. The night you left, the Christmas when you told me you'd been accepted to that architecture program, and I said I wouldn't pay for it. I wasn't angry that you wanted to leave. I was terrified you would succeed without me, that you would prove you never needed me at all. My pride couldn't bear it. Sarah wiped her eyes, remembering the shouting match that had ended with her packing a bag and walking out into the snow, never to return except for her mother's funeral 2 years later. I was wrong, Sarah. About everything. You were right to leave, right to build your own life. I watched your career from afar. Every award, every building with your name on it. I collected the articles. Ask Walter, he'll give you the folder. The letter continued, but a shadow fell across the page. Sarah looked up to find Michael standing over her, his own letter crumpled in his fist. Did you know? He demanded, his voice tight with anger. Did you know about Dad and Jake? Sarah shook her head, confused. What about them? Michael laughed bitterly. Of course not. You weren't here. He thrust his crumpled letter at her. Read it. Hesitantly, Sarah smoothed out the paper. Their father's handwriting, addressing Michael. Son, there's no easy way to tell you this. Jake Wilson is not just my most trusted employee. He's my son, your half-brother. It happened during a rough patch in my marriage, before Rebecca was born. His mother worked as our office manager briefly. When she told me she was pregnant, I paid her to leave town and keep quiet. She returned to Oak Ridge when Jake was 18, and he sought work at Thompson Construction not knowing who I was. By the time I realized who he was, he'd already proven himself invaluable. Sarah looked up at Michael, shocked. Does Jake know? Apparently Dad told him a year ago. They've been having secret father-son bonding while I've been running myself into the ground managing the company. Michael paced in front of the bench. And now I'm supposed to make him partner? The secret bastard son gets a piece of what should have been entirely mine. Michael, don't, he snapped. Don't defend him. Dad betrayed our mother, hid a son for decades, stole your designs, and now he's forcing me to share my birthright with a stranger. He's destroying this family from the grave. Sarah stood, facing her brother. Have you talked to Jake? Why would I? As far as I'm concerned, he's been lying to me for years too. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. Rebecca walked toward them, her face pale, her own letter clutched against her chest. Behind her trailed Ethan, looking uncomfortable in the family drama. I see we all had the same idea, Rebecca said quietly, gesturing to the park. This is where we always came to escape him. Sarah nodded. The three Thompson children, reunited in their childhood sanctuary, each holding pieces of a puzzle they never knew existed. He told me who Ethan's father is, Rebecca said abruptly. Michael and Sarah exchanged glances. Rebecca had gotten pregnant at 17 and had steadfastly refused to name the father. Their parents had supported her decision to keep and raise the child, but it had been a scandal in small-town Oak Ridge. Mom knew, but they decided to keep it quiet for everyone's protection, Rebecca continued, her voice flat. It was Jason Whitfield, the mayor's son? Michael exclaimed. But he died in that car accident a month after I got pregnant. Yes. Rebecca's eyes were dry but vacant. Apparently his parents knew too. That's why they've always been so generous to the business, steering city contracts to Thompson Construction. It wasn't just Dad's charm, it was guilt and obligation. Sarah sank back onto the bench. The Whitfields were Oak Ridge royalty, old money with political connections stretching back generations. If this got out, it would rock the foundations of the town. Does Ethan know? Sarah asked gently. Rebecca shook her head. I'm telling him tonight. He deserves the truth. She glanced back at her son, who had wandered to the park's edge, giving the adults space. Dad says in his letter that he's arranged for Ethan to receive shares in the Whitfield family trust. They've apparently been setting it aside for him all these years. Michael laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Well, isn't this perfect? Dad's throwing money and shares at everyone except me. I get the company, sure, but with strings attached. A surprise brother as partner and the burden of all these secrets. That's not fair, Sarah protested. You're not the only one dealing with bombshells here. No, Michael challenged. Then tell me, Sarah, why did you really leave? What's in your letter that you're not sharing? Sarah hesitated, looking down at her father's words. There was more, pages more, detailing business decisions she'd need to understand, explaining why he'd kept tabs on her career, confessing his regret and pride. But at the bottom, in a shaky postscript, was the part she couldn't bring herself to say aloud. P.S. The real reason I couldn't face you after you left. Every time I looked at you, I saw your mother's strength and knew you discovered what she never did, that I wasn't worth staying for. You were brave enough to save yourself. I'm so sorry I made that necessary. Well, Michael pressed. Sarah folded the letter carefully. He apologized, she said simply. Too little, too late, maybe. But he knew he was wrong. Rebecca sat beside Sarah on the bench. So what happens now? We've all got pieces of Dad we never knew existed. Do we just go back to our separate lives and pretend this never happened? The three siblings fell silent, watching as the sun began its descent behind the Oak Ridge Town Hall in the distance. The building's clock tower had marked their childhoods, its bells signaling curfews and celebrations. Now it seemed to be waiting, counting down to a decision none of them were ready to make. The Thompson siblings agreed to meet at their father's office the next morning. Not the impressive corner suite at Thompson Construction headquarters, but his home office in what was now Rebecca's house, the place where Richard Thompson had apparently been orchestrating posthumous chaos. Sarah arrived first, having barely slept at her hotel. She'd spent half the night reading and rereading her father's letter, and the other half researching the riverfront development online. The project was even more ambitious than she'd imagined, and more controversial. Environmental concerns, disputes over displaced local businesses, zoning battles. Her father had left her not just an asset, but a minefield. She was studying the large project map pinned to the wall when Michael walked in, looking equally exhausted. "Have you spoken to Jake?" she asked without preamble. Michael's jaw tightened. "He called 6 times last night. I didn't answer. He deserves better than that." "Does he?" Michael dropped his briefcase on their father's desk. "For all I know, he's been plotting this for years. Get close to the legitimate son, earn his trust, then use Dad's guilt to secure a partnership. Or maybe he's just as blindsided as we are," Sarah countered. "Maybe he's known for exactly 1 year that the boss he respected is his biological father, and now he's being thrust into a family drama he never asked for." Before Michael could respond, Rebecca entered with Walter Grayson. The lawyer carried a large accordion file and looked grimmer than he had at the will reading. "I've asked Walter to join us," Rebecca explained, "because after reading Dad's letter, I have questions only he can answer." They settled around the office, Sarah by the window, Michael in their father's chair, Rebecca and Walter on the leather sofa beneath framed photographs of construction projects spanning 4 decades. "I understand you've all had time to read Richard's letters," Walter began. "He anticipated you would have questions, which is why he asked me to serve not just as executor, but as, well, as the keeper of the complete truth." "And what truth is that?" Michael asked sharply. "That our father was a liar and a thief who kept secrets from everyone he supposedly loved?" Walter didn't flinch. "Your father was a complicated man who made serious mistakes. But in his final months, he was determined to make what amends he could." Sarah leaned forward. "Did you know?" "About all of it. Jake, Ethan's father, my designs." "Yes," Walter admitted. "I've been your father's lawyer and friend for 40 years. I knew his sins and his regrets." "And you said nothing?" Michael accused. "Client confidentiality," Walter replied evenly. "But more than that, these weren't my truths to tell. Richard needed to find his own path to confession." Rebecca, who had been unnaturally quiet, finally spoke. "I told Ethan about his father last night." All eyes turned to her. "How did he take it?" Sarah asked gently. "Better than I expected. He's always wondered, of course." Rebecca twisted her hands in her lap. "He wants to meet the Whitfields, his grandparents. I don't know if I can face them after all these years of awkward charity." "You don't have to do it alone," Sarah said, surprising herself with the offer. "I could go with you." Rebecca looked up, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "You would do that?" "Of course. We're still family, aren't we?" Michael scoffed. "Are we?" "Because it seems to me that Dad did his level best to ensure we'd be at each other's throats. What kind of father turns his children into rivals from beyond the grave?" "One who knew his children needed the truth more than they needed harmony," Walter suggested. Richard was dying. He didn't have time for gradual revelations. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jake Wilson stood in the doorway, his expression a mixture of determination and uncertainty. In his Thompson construction jacket and worn work boots, he looked every inch the foreman he'd been. Until yesterday. "I'm sorry to intrude," he said. "I've been trying to reach Michael, and when he didn't answer, I thought." His voice trailed off as he took in the tableau of tense faces. Michael stood. "We're in the middle of a family meeting." Jake flinched at the emphasis on family, but held his ground. "That's why I'm here. Like it or not, according to Richard, I'm part of this family now." Sarah studied the man who was apparently her half-brother. He was in his early 40s, with their father's build and something of his manner, but his eyes were different, kinder, less calculating. "Jake, please join us," she said, ignoring Michael's glare. "We're trying to make sense of everything." Jake hesitated, then stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I never asked for any of this," he said. "When Richard told me, I was shocked. I'd worked for him for 20 years without knowing." "Convenient," Michael muttered. "It's the truth," Jake insisted. "My mother never told me who my father was. When I applied at Thompson Construction, it was because they had the best reputation in town. I worked my way up because I'm good at what I do, not because of DNA." Rebecca studied him. "Did you know about us? That we were your siblings?" Jake nodded slowly. "Richard told me. He showed me family photos, talked about each of you. He was proud, especially of how you raised Ethan on your own," he said to Rebecca, "and of Sarah's success as an architect." He turned to Michael. "And he relied on you more than you know. He called you the backbone of everything he'd built." Michael's expression remained stony. If that's true, why would he undermine me by forcing me to make you partner? I don't want to be made partner out of obligation. Jake replied firmly. I'd rather earn it, or walk away entirely. Sarah watched her brother's face, saw the conflict there. Michael had always been their father's lieutenant, living for his approval. Now he was being asked to share not just the company, but their father's legacy with a stranger who shared their blood. You didn't know about any of the rest of it? Sarah asked Jake. About Ethan's father? About my designs being used for Riverfront? Jake shook his head. Richard compartmentalized everything. He told me I was his son, but the rest? No, I'm learning this with you. Walter cleared his throat. If I may, there's something else you should all know. He opened the accordion file and removed a thick folder. Richard left instructions that after you'd had time to absorb the initial revelations, I should share these with you. He handed the folder to Sarah. Inside were dozens of newspaper clippings, magazine articles, and printed web pages, all about her career. Awards she'd won, buildings she'd designed, interviews she'd given. Some had notes in the margins in her father's handwriting. Brilliant solution to the space constraints. Just like I taught her, function before form. She outshone every architect at the firm. Sarah's throat tightened. All those years, she'd thought he didn't care. In reality, he'd been following her career with a pride he'd never expressed directly. Walter handed similar folders to the others. Michael's contained performance reviews and project assessments, evidence of his value to the company beyond being the boss's son. Rebecca's held every school program, sports certificate, and achievement of Ethan's that Richard had collected over the years, along with legal documents showing how he'd quietly pressured the Whitfields to establish a trust for the boy. Jake received a thinner folder, articles about projects he'd managed, photos of him at construction sites, and a handwritten timeline of his career at Thompson Construction with notes about his rise through the ranks on merit alone. He was trying, in his way, Walter said softly. The Richard I knew 40 years ago wouldn't have bothered with any of this. The man he became at the end wanted desperately to fix what he'd broken, even if he didn't know how. The room fell silent as they each absorbed this new perspective on the father they thought they knew. Finally, Sarah spoke. I can't forgive him overnight for everything, but I'm willing to try to understand him better. She looked at her siblings, all of them, including Jake. And I want to know the family I left behind. The real one, not the version I've been angry at for years. Rebecca nodded slowly. I'd like that too. She glanced at Jake. All of us. All eyes turned to Michael, who stood at their father's desk, one hand resting on the polished surface where Richard Thompson had made decades of decisions that shaped their lives. He wasn't a good father, Michael said finally, or a good husband, or even always a good man. He looked up, meeting each of their gazes in turn. But he built something that matters in this town. And maybe, if we can find a way past all this anger, we can build something better. He extended his hand to Jake. I'm not promising partnership yet, but I'm willing to talk about it. Jake accepted the handshake, relief evident in his face. That's all I'm asking for. Sarah watched her brothers, the one she'd grown up with and the one she'd just discovered, and felt something shift inside her. The family she'd fled had been broken by secrets and silence. The family forming now, fragile and uncertain, at least had a chance at honesty. Walter smiled faintly. There's one last thing Richard wanted me to tell you all. Thompson Construction's bid for the Riverfront project is being evaluated by the City Council next week. If the company secures the contract, it will be the largest project in Oak Ridge history. And if Sarah controls the Riverfront shares, Rebecca began. And Michael runs Thompson Construction. Sarah continued. With Jake potentially as partner. Michael added. Walter nodded. You'll all have to work together, whether you want to or not. I believe Richard called it forced reconciliation through mutual interest. Despite everything, Sarah felt a laugh bubble up. It was so like her father, manipulative to the end, convinced he knew best, but in his twisted way, trying to bring his children together. So, she said, looking around at her complicated, expanding family. Who's ready to rebuild? The next week passed in a blur of meetings and revelations. Sarah extended her stay at the Oak Ridge Inn, postponing her return to Boston indefinitely. She'd called her firm and arranged to work remotely, explaining only that a family emergency required her attention. It wasn't exactly a lie. The first strategy session for the Riverfront presentation happened at Thompson Construction headquarters, In a conference room with windows overlooking the actual riverfront area in question, a neglected stretch of warehouses and vacant lots that had once been the industrial heart of Oak Ridge. Sarah stood at the head of the table, her original sketchbooks open beside current plans. "The core concept is the same," she explained, trying to keep her voice neutral despite the strange feeling of presenting her teenage ideas to a room of professionals. Mixed-use development that preserves the historical elements while creating new spaces for commerce, residents, and community. Michael sat stiffly across from Jake, both men taking studious notes and avoiding direct eye contact. The tension between them was palpable, but they maintained professional composure. "The environmental concerns are legitimate," Sarah continued, addressing the biggest obstacle to approval. "But I've been reviewing the plans, and I think we can actually improve on Dad's approach." She flipped to a new page in her notebook. "If we incorporate these green infrastructure elements, permeable surfaces, native plantings, rainwater collection, we can turn environmental mitigation from a cost center into a selling point." Rebecca, who had insisted on attending despite having no official role in the project, spoke up. "The Whitfields will support that approach. Mrs. Whitfield is on the board of the Oak Ridge Conservation Trust." All eyes turned to her. "How do you know that?" Michael asked. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "Ethan and I met with them yesterday. They want to be publicly acknowledged as his grandparents, and they're willing to back our bid for Riverfront in exchange." Michael's expression darkened. "So they're still using their influence to manipulate this family?" "It's not like that," Rebecca protested. "They want a relationship with Ethan. They've missed 17 years already." Jake cleared his throat. "Politics aside, their support would significantly improve our chances with the council." "He's right," Sarah agreed, studying her brother. "Michael, I know you hate feeling leveraged, but we need to be practical." Michael stood abruptly. "Fine. Make the deal with the Whitfields. Just like Dad would have." He gathered his papers. "I have another meeting. Jake can fill me in on anything I miss." After he left, an awkward silence fell over the room. Finally, Jake spoke. "He's trying. This is hard for him." "It's hard for all of us," Rebecca pointed out. Sarah nodded, closing her sketchbook. "We're asking a lot from each other, considering we've all been strangers for years." She looked at Jake. "Some of us, literal strangers." Jake offered a tentative smile. "For what it's worth, I always admired the Thompson siblings from afar. The boss's kids were legendary around the office. Sarah the brilliant rebel, Michael the driven heir, Rebecca the resilient one." Rebecca laughed softly. "Were those our labels? I always thought of myself as the afterthought." "Never," Jake said with surprising firmness. "Richard talked about you differently than the others. He said you had the purest heart of all his children." Sarah watched this exchange with interest. Jake seemed genuinely kind, lacking the Thompson edge that their father had passed to his acknowledged children. Perhaps being raised away from Richard's influence had been a blessing. "We should continue this over dinner," Sarah suggested impulsively. "All of us, including Michael and Ethan. Not talking business, just getting to know each other." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I'd like that. I'll convince Michael somehow." "Briggs Steakhouse at 7? Jake suggested. "Neutral territory." They agreed, and the meeting shifted back to business. But something had changed in the room, a tentative warmth where there had been only professional courtesy before. That evening, Sarah arrived at Briggs first, securing the private dining room in the back. The restaurant was Oak Ridge's finest, housed in a converted 19th-century bank building with original woodwork and brass fixtures. She'd celebrated her high school graduation here, the last happy family memory before everything fell apart. Rebecca and Ethan arrived next. At 17, Ethan was tall and lanky, with Rebecca's dark eyes but a bearing that suddenly made sense as Whitfield heritage, the same self-assured posture Sarah had observed in the mayor at town functions. "Aunt Sarah," he said with a tentative smile. In his lifetime, she'd been more myth than relative, appearances limited to his grandmother's funeral and a handful of stilted holiday calls. "Ethan," she replied, surprised when he moved in for a hug. "It's good to see you. Really see you. Mom says you designed some famous buildings in Boston," he said as they sat down. Sarah smiled. "A few. Are you interested in architecture?" "I don't know yet, but I'm interested in hearing about a life outside Oak Ridge." Before Sarah could respond, Jake entered, followed by Michael, whose tight expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. "I brought wine." Jake announced, holding up 2 bottles. A peace offering. Michael took his seat without acknowledging the gesture. Let's get this family bonding over with. Rebecca kicked him under the table. Behave, she whispered. Their server, a young woman who introduced herself as Tina, seemed oblivious to the tension as she distributed menus and described the evening specials. When she left, an awkward silence descended. So, Sarah said finally, here we all are. One big happy family, Michael muttered. Jake poured wine for everyone, including a small amount for Ethan with a questioning glance at Rebecca, who nodded her permission. I'd like to propose a toast, Jake said, raising his glass. To new beginnings. It was simple and sincere, and Sarah found herself raising her glass along with the others. Even Michael participated, though his expression remained guarded. Can I ask something? Ethan spoke up after they'd ordered. Were you guys always like this? Even when you were kids? The 3 original Thompson siblings exchanged glances. Like what? Michael asked. So, careful with each other. Mom has all these photos where you look happy, but you act like you barely know each other now. Out of the mouths of babes, Sarah thought. Leave it to a teenager to cut through the pretense. We were close once, she admitted. Before I left. Before you abandoned us, Michael corrected, but the edge in his voice had softened slightly. We were different people then, Rebecca added. Before Mom died, before Dad changed. Jake listened intently, absorbing the family history he'd never been part of. I have an idea, Ethan said, leaning forward. Let's play 2 truths and a lie. But the truths have to be something no one here knows about you. Ethan, Rebecca began. I don't think. Actually, that's perfect, Sarah interrupted. We need to start somewhere. To everyone's surprise, Michael nodded. I'll go first. He took a sip of wine. 1. I applied to art school before Dad convinced me to study business. 2. I kept every letter Sarah sent after she left, even though I never answered them. 3. I've been considering selling my share of the company for the past year. Sarah stared at her brother. You got letters from me? Dad intercepted them, Michael replied. Gave them to me after Mom died. Said I should know you tried to stay in touch. And you kept them? Rebecca asked softly. Michael shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. That's the game. Which one's the lie? Sarah studied him. This brother she thought she knew. The third one. You'd never sell your share. Michael held her gaze. Wrong. I've had an offer from Westlake developers since January. He turned to Jake. That's why Dad's demand to make you partner hit so hard. I was finally finding a way out. The table fell silent as the implications sank in. Michael, the loyal son who stayed, had been planning his own escape. Your turn, Michael said to Sarah, challenging her. As the main courses arrived, Sarah realized that whatever happened with Riverfront, the true reconstruction project was sitting around this table. A family built on a foundation of secrets was being demolished and rebuilt, one uncomfortable truth at a time. The Whitfield estate sat on 10 acres at the edge of Oak Ridge, a colonial revival mansion with white columns and perfectly manicured gardens. Sarah pulled her rental car through the wrought iron gates, glancing at Rebecca in the passenger seat. Her sister had barely spoken during the 20-minute drive, her hands fidgeting nervously in her lap. We can still turn around, Sarah offered. Rebecca shook her head. Ethan's already inside. He came early too. I don't know, break the ice? They seemed eager to have time alone with him. Sarah parked beside a sleek black Mercedes. How are you feeling about all this? Terrified. Angry. Relieved. Rebecca sighed. For 17 years, I've carried this secret. Now suddenly everyone knows, and I'm expected to play nice with the people who treated me like a charity case while hiding that I was the mother of their only grandchild. Sarah reached over and squeezed her sister's hand. You don't owe them anything. We're here on your terms. The front door opened before they reached it. Margaret Whitfield stood in the entryway, a slender woman in her 60s with impeccable posture and the same dark eyes as Ethan. Behind her loomed her husband, Senator James Whitfield, who had succeeded his brother as mayor of Oak Ridge 20 years ago before moving on to state politics. Rebecca, Sarah, Margaret greeted them with a tense smile. Please come in. Ethan is showing us his photography portfolio in the solarium. They followed the Whitfields through a house that exuded old money and careful preservation. Family portraits lined the hallway, generations of Whitfields looking affluent and self-assured. Near the end hung a photo of Jason, forever young in his graduation cap and gown. Rebecca paused before it. He never knew, she said quietly. About the baby. We'd broken up weeks before I realized. Margaret stopped beside her. He spoke of you often, even after the relationship ended. He would have done the right thing. I didn't need him to do the right thing, Rebecca replied, an edge to her voice. I needed to make my own choices. Margaret's expression softened unexpectedly. Of course you did. I would have done the same at your age. She glanced at her husband, who had continued ahead. James wanted to approach you after we learned about the pregnancy from Richard. I insisted we respect your privacy. Perhaps that was a mistake. Sarah watched this exchange with surprise. The Margaret Whitfield she remembered from town functions had always seemed coldly perfect, not this woman expressing regret. In the solarium, Ethan was showing his grandfather a series of black and white photographs displayed on an iPad. The boy looked completely at ease, as if he'd been visiting his grandparents his entire life instead of just discovering their relationship days ago. Mom, Aunt Sarah, Ethan waved them over. Grandpa was just saying I have Jason's eye for composition. Senator Whitfield nodded, his expression a complex mixture of pride and old grief. The resemblance is remarkable in more ways than one. Please sit. Margaret gestured to a seating area where tea had been arranged. We have much to discuss. Over the next hour, an unexpected conversation unfolded. The Whitfields explained how Richard Thompson had approached them after learning of Rebecca's pregnancy, how they had established a trust for Ethan that Rebecca had never known about, and how they had watched from afar as their grandson grew up. We should have been more direct, Senator Whitfield admitted. Fear of scandal kept us from acknowledging Ethan publicly. It's our greatest regret. That, and pushing Jason too hard, Margaret added quietly. We thought we were securing his future. Instead, we drove him to take risks, to rebel. The car accident that killed Jason had happened after a party celebrating his acceptance to an Ivy League school his parents had chosen for him. He'd been driving too fast on a rainy night. Running from expectations, Rebecca had always believed. I need to ask, Rebecca said after a pause. The contracts with Thompson Construction over the years. Was that your way of supporting us? Senator Whitfield nodded. Partly, but Richard earned those contracts on merit. We simply ensured he was always invited to bid. Sarah thought of Michael, who had worked relentlessly to maintain those relationships, unaware of the family connection greasing the wheels. And Riverfront? She asked. Will you support our bid because of Ethan, or because it's the best proposal for Oak Ridge? Senator Whitfield smiled thinly. Can it be both? Family obligations aside, I've reviewed your original concepts, Ms. Thompson. They're visionary. Oak Ridge needs that vision. We would like to establish a more formal relationship with Ethan, Margaret said, changing the subject. College is approaching, and we'd like to be involved in that process. Rebecca tensed. Ethan will make his own choices about college. Of course, Margaret responded smoothly. But the Whitfield name comes with connections that could open doors. Ethan, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. I'd like to explore those options, Mom. Not to use the influence, but to understand what's possible. He turned to his grandparents. But I'm not changing my last name. I'm a Thompson. Pride flashed across Rebecca's face, and Sarah felt a surge of affection for her nephew. He was navigating this complex situation with remarkable maturity. As they prepared to leave 2 hours later, Senator Whitfield drew Sarah aside, while Rebecca and Ethan said their goodbyes to Margaret. I understand you control the Riverfront shares, he said without preamble. Sarah nodded cautiously. Your father approached me last year with concerns about the project. He believed there were elements of the original environmental impact study that were problematic. Sarah frowned. What kind of problems? The kind that might be discovered during construction, Whitfield replied cryptically. The kind that could halt the project midway and trigger investigations. Are you saying the study was falsified? Whitfield's expression remained neutral. I'm saying Richard was concerned enough to consider pulling out entirely. Instead, he restructured ownership and left control to you, the only Thompson with no involvement in the original approval process. Sarah felt a chill. Why are you telling me this now? Because despite family connections, I won't support a flawed project. Before the council votes next week, I need assurance you'll address any irregularities that might emerge. Without knowing what those irregularities are, Richard kept documentation. Walter Grayson has it. Whitfield glanced toward Rebecca and Ethan. Handle this discreetly, for everyone's sake. On the drive back, Sarah remained quiet, processing this new information while Rebecca chatted about the surprising success of the visit. She dropped her sister and nephew at home, then drove directly to Walter Grayson's office. The elderly lawyer seemed unsurprised by her unscheduled appearance. "Senator Whitfield mentioned you have documents my father left regarding Riverfront," she said once they were settled in his cluttered office. "Environmental concerns." Walter sighed heavily and unlocked a drawer in his desk. "I was instructed to provide these only if you specifically asked." He withdrew a sealed envelope. Richard discovered the problems 6 months ago. By then, his illness was advanced, and he had limited options. Sarah opened the envelope and scanned the contents, her architect's eye quickly grasping the implications. The soil testing results had been selectively reported, obscuring evidence of chemical contamination from the site's industrial past. Proper remediation would add millions to the project cost. "Did Michael know?" she asked, looking up. Walter shook his head. Richard kept this between himself and the environmental consultant, who has since retired to Florida. "And Jake?" "No." As project manager, Jake worked with the results he was given. Sarah leaned back, suddenly understanding her father's strategy. By giving her control of Riverfront, he positioned the only Thompson who could reveal the problem without being implicated in its creation. "If this comes out during construction, the scandal would destroy Thompson Construction," she said slowly. Walter nodded. "And likely generate criminal charges. But if we disclose it now, address it properly in the new proposal, the project costs increase substantially, possibly making it financially unviable." Sarah gathered the documents. "I need to talk to Michael and Jake." "Your father believed you would make the right choice," Walter said as she stood to leave. "Whatever that might be." "The right choice for whom?" Sarah asked bitterly. "The family business? The environment? Oak Ridge?" Walter's expression softened. "For the legacy he wanted to leave. Not the business, Sarah. The family." Sarah drove to her hotel in a daze, the weight of her father's final manipulation settling on her shoulders. She had fled Oak Ridge to escape Richard Thompson's control, only to find herself executing his last wishes from beyond the grave. The truth would devastate Michael, who had built his professional identity on Thompson Construction's reputation. It would implicate Jake, who had unknowingly managed a compromised project. It would jeopardize the Whitfield's support, despite their foreknowledge. And it would force Sarah to choose between exposing her father's wrongdoing or becoming complicit in his deception. Some legacies, she realized, weren't gifts. They were burdens disguised as inheritance, passed from one generation to the next like a family disease. Sarah spent a sleepless night reviewing the environmental documents, searching for solutions. By morning, she'd outlined 3 possible approaches: reveal everything publicly, perform the remediation secretly while absorbing the costs, or walk away from Riverfront entirely. None felt right. She called an emergency meeting at Thompson Construction, requesting a secure conference room with no staff present. Michael arrived first, agitation visible in his tense shoulders. "This better be important," he said, checking his watch. "The council presentation is tomorrow, and we're still finalizing numbers." "It's important," Sarah assured him. "We need to wait for Jake." Michael frowned. "Why?" "Because this affects all of us." She hesitated. "I've also asked Rebecca to join. This is a family decision." Before Michael could protest, Jake entered, followed closely by Rebecca. They all took seats around the table, expressions curious and concerned. Sarah took a deep breath. "I need to show you something Dad left behind." She distributed copies of the environmental documents. "Take your time. It's complicated." Silence fell as they read. Michael finished first, his face draining of color. He stood abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the town his family had helped build for generations. "Michael," Rebecca prompted gently. "He knew," Michael said flatly. "He falsified environmental reports and proceeded anyway." Jake studied the documents, professional expertise evident in his focused examination. "The contamination is manageable with proper remediation, but it would add at least $8 million to the budget." $8 million we don't have," Michael said, turning back to face them. "Not without additional investors or significantly scaling back the project scope." Rebecca looked up from her copy. "What happens if we just reveal this at the council meeting? Get ahead of it." "Thompson Construction would likely be barred from city contracts for years," Jake answered. "There could be criminal liability." "For who?" Rebecca pressed. An uncomfortable silence fell. Finally, Sarah spoke. For Michael, as current head of the company, possibly for Jake, as project manager, and posthumously for Dad. Michael laughed bitterly. Perfect. His final gift is potential prison time. Jake set down the papers. I didn't know about this. I swear to all of you, I worked with the reports I was given. I believe you, Sarah said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. Over the past weeks, she'd come to respect Jake's integrity. The question is what we do now. Michael paced the length of the conference room. If we withdraw the bid, questions will be asked. If we proceed knowing about the contamination, we're complicit. If we reveal it, the company is finished. He stopped suddenly. Unless. All eyes turned to him. Unless we create a new entity, Michael continued, thinking aloud. Thompson Wilson Environmental Restoration. A joint venture between Thompson Construction and a new firm headed by Jake. We publicly announced the discovery of previously unreported contamination, position ourselves as the solution rather than the problem. Sarah blinked, impressed by her brother's quick thinking. That could work. It distances the current leadership from Dad's decisions while still keeping the project in the family. It would require complete transparency going forward, Jake cautioned. And we'd need to approach the council for tax incentives to offset the remediation costs. The Whitfields would support that, Rebecca added, especially if we frame it as environmental stewardship. Michael turned to Jake. You'd need to form your own company immediately. On paper, you'd have no connection to Thompson Construction during the initial environmental assessment. You'd be the whistleblower who caught the problem and the expert who can fix it. Jake considered this. It would mean stepping away from the partnership offer. Temporarily, Michael clarified. Once the project is underway with proper remediation, we could revisit integration. Sarah watched this exchange with growing admiration. Michael was demonstrating leadership she hadn't known he possessed, creative, strategic, and collaborative. There's one more thing, she said. Someone will need to answer for the original falsification. We can't let that fall on random employees or consultants who might have been pressured by Dad. The room fell silent again. Finally, Rebecca spoke up. Dad's already gone. His reputation can bear this. Michael shook his head. The Richard Thompson I knew would never have done this. He was demanding, sometimes ruthless, but not dishonest. Not with something that could endanger people. People change, Sarah said quietly. His illness, maybe. Fear of failure. Or protection, Jake suggested. All eyes turned to him. What if he was protecting someone? Sarah felt a chill. What do you mean? The timing, Jake explained. Richard discovered this 6 months ago, when his cancer was already advanced. But the original testing was done 3 years ago. Who was in charge of the environmental assessment then? Michael paled. I was. I oversaw the initial approvals while Dad focused on land acquisition. He sank into a chair. But I never falsified anything. I worked with the reports from the consulting firm. Which consulting firm? Jake pressed. Greenspace Environmental. They were the lowest bid. Michael rubbed his face. The principal was Martin Reeves, an old friend of Dad's from college. Sarah pulled out her phone and searched the name. Martin Reeves died 18 months ago. Convenient, Rebecca murmured. So Dad discovered his old friend had provided faulty reports that I had accepted without sufficient scrutiny, Michael summarized. And rather than expose the problem and implicate me, he kept it quiet while looking for a solution. Then got sick and ran out of time, Sarah finished. So he restructured ownership to give me control of Riverfront, knowing I'd eventually discover the issue, and would be the only one who could address it without self-incrimination, Jake added. Michael stood again, decision made. We go with my plan. Jake forms an independent environmental assessment company. Sarah, as Riverfront owner, hires him to perform due diligence before proceeding. He discovers the problem. We publicly disclose it, place the blame on the deceased consultant, and position ourselves as the solution. It protects the company, addresses the contamination, and keeps the project viable, Sarah agreed. But it means letting Dad take the fall for trusting his friend. I think he'd consider that a fair trade for protecting his son, Rebecca said softly. The next day, they stood together before the Oak Ridge City Council. Sarah led the presentation, outlining the original vision for Riverfront and introducing her siblings. Michael detailed the economic benefits, job creation, and tax revenue projections. Jake, now introduced as an independent environmental consultant, explained his role in assessing the site for safety and sustainability. When they addressed the contamination issue, a ripple of shock went through the council chambers. Senator Whitfield, seated in the front row, maintained a carefully neutral expression as Sarah explained the discovery of irregularities in the original environmental assessment. Rather than proceeding on a flawed foundation, she concluded, Thompson Construction and Riverfront Development are committed to full remediation before a single residential or commercial building goes up. We've established a separate environmental restoration entity headed by Jake Wilson, who will oversee this process with complete transparency. Michael stepped forward. My father built Thompson Construction on the principle that we build to last. That means acknowledging mistakes, even painful ones, and making them right. The additional remediation will add costs and time to the project, but we believe Oak Ridge deserves nothing less than our absolute commitment to safety and integrity. After the council voted unanimously to approve the revised proposal, complete with tax incentives for the remediation phase, Senator Whitfield approached the Thompson siblings. Impressive recovery, he said quietly. Richard would be proud. Would he? Sarah asked. We just publicly undermined his reputation. Whitfield smiled thinly. Richard cared about legacy more than reputation. The Thompson name continues, the company survives, and the family stands united. That's what mattered to him in the end. As they gathered their materials, Rebecca touched Sarah's arm. Are you still planning to return to Boston next week? Sarah hesitated. She'd been asking herself the same question since the revelation about Riverfront. Her life in Boston felt distant now, almost belonging to a different person. I'm considering options, she said carefully. Riverfront will need architectural oversight. Someone who understands the original vision. Michael, overhearing, approached. You could open an Oak Ridge branch of your firm. We'll need a local architect of record anyway. Are you offering me a job, Michael? Sarah asked, half joking. I'm suggesting a partnership, he replied seriously. You, me, Jake. Building something better than Dad ever imagined. Something with integrity built in from the ground up. Jake joined them, loosening his tie after the formal presentation. I'd vote for that arrangement. Sarah looked at her brothers, one she'd grown up with and one she was just getting to know, and then at Rebecca, who had remained in Oak Ridge all these years, keeping the family's emotional foundation intact despite the cracks. I need to find a place to live, she said tentatively. Rebecca smiled. The house is too big for just Ethan and me. Your old room is exactly as you left it, angry teenager posters and all. God, please renovate that before anyone sees it, Sarah laughed. Outside the council building, they paused on the steps. Below them spread the town of Oak Ridge, the river winding through its center like a silver thread binding past to future. The warehouses and vacant lots of the riverfront district waited for transformation, for the Thompson family to make their mark once again, this time together. It won't be easy, Michael warned. We're all too stubborn and too damaged to play happy family right away. But we're trying, Rebecca pointed out. That's more than we've done in years. To new beginnings, Jake said, echoing his toast from their dinner. Sarah considered her siblings, thinking about all they had discovered and all they had lost. Their father had manipulated them to the very end, forcing reconciliation through mutual need. But perhaps that manipulation had given them something valuable after all, a chance to rebuild not just a riverfront, but a family. To breaking ground, she amended, looking toward the river. In all the ways that matter.